Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our free Thursday webinar. I'm Nikki Jovicic from Lookupstrata, and I'm also the Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, and I'm your host today. As lot owners, committee members and managers, we share a common goal to ensure our buildings are safe, functional and well maintained. However, in a recent survey by the Building Commission New South Wales in partnership with SCA New South Wales, it was revealed that 53% of strata communities in New South Wales had serious defects. Building defects are a pervasive issue in strata communities with serious consequences for both residents and property owners. And defects in your building can range from minor inconveniences to major safety hazards. And if left unchecked, they can escalate into costly repairs and even endanger the lives of residents. Today, we're fortunate to be joined again by Bruce McKenzie from Sedgwick. Bruce will discuss the early warning signs of building defects, covering both the obvious and the not so obvious, providing practical examples and insights you can apply to your building. We'll also explore proactive measures owners can take to prevent defects from escalating and minimising their impact. Prevention is better than cure, and being vigilant and addressing issues promptly, we can protect our investments and ensure the long-term sustainability of our strata communities. Now, this is a national session, so with inclusivity in mind, we're aware that terminology changes across Australia. So if we're talking about committees, that's also known as the Strata Council or Council of Owners. And if we mention the Owners Corporation, we're talking about the body corporate or the strata company, depending on your state. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information in the session, including the discussions arising from submitted questions and chat conversations, is not advice and should not be relied upon as advice. And you should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in this session. And we're very happy to welcome back Bruce McKenzie, National Manager for Commercial Services and Major Projects at Sedgwick. With over 36 years of experience, Bruce has a strong building construction and project management background, having worked as a licensed building contractor and qualified supervisor. This has given Bruce a deep understanding of the complexities of building defects and remediation. Bruce was Program Director for the Cladding Safety Victoria program, developing and implementing systems for cladding replacement, and he was seconded to the Office of the New South Wales Building Commissioner as the Acting Program Director for Project Intervene, and this initiative focused on addressing building defects and ensuring the safety and quality of buildings in New South Wales. His expertise in building construction and defect remediation was invaluable in that role. Welcome, Bruce. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, welcome everyone. It's good to shed some knowledge again on this topic of defects. As Nikki pointed out, I've been involved heavily over the last 10 years in all sorts of different programs and projects in defects. And one of the things I've been able to do, particularly over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, is gather a lot of information, a lot of data on what's trending in buildings, what's happening most with defects, and also how owners are responding to those defects and perhaps some things that they could do better or focus on a little bit more to assist. So the topics I'm going to cover today is just briefly, in my view, the strata defect journey. So how we've sort of got to where we are now in terms of defects, some discoveries and trends, as I mentioned, on projects we've worked on in particular, some telltale signs I'll cover off on what we see on the ground, and things, in my view, I think owners could potentially notice as well. You don't necessarily need to be a building expert to notice some of these things to help put that red flag up in the air. Notifications and prevention, so just some things on how to notify or the right time to notify and what to do to help prevention, and some proactive measures as well. So I'll just jump in. The first slide just covers off on some topics I think most people have heard before, but I'll cover it anyway. It's why are there so many defects in strata? There's lots of theories on this, and my discoveries over the last few years, they normally focus on any of these 4 key pillar areas. So they can be a design or construction, they can be a result of cost or cost reductions, or even process error where things are just simply not done right. The most common things we've come across over the years is failure to provide detailed design. So the model that the industry has gone towards over the last 20 years, it has reduced the amount of design that goes into some of these newer buildings, and it's to the detriment of the building because often things are not done properly. Failure to follow design standards, and quality control is a big one on many projects at the moment. If we look at a timeline there, and we go back to say 1980s, which is getting back towards the beginning of my career, and I do remember when I started, if you look at that diagram there was quite a lot of people involved in the design and the supervision stage of a project. So lots of designers, lots of people like clerk of works, it's an old term, but there was more inspectors on the ground, people who were involved. And then you had your trades who would work through and get the project completed. The difference now leading into 2020 and beyond is we're very, very top heavy on the trade. So we are stacking these sites with a lot of trades, and the design and the supervision is slimmed right down now due to cost. And that's inherently where we face a lot of problems. So things like increased profit margins, maintaining the consumer demand. The consumers, us as consumers, do demand products quickly, and we like volume. We have a housing crisis at the moment, so that's the demand side of it. A lean budget is often set, which is unfortunate, but that's the competitiveness of the market at the moment. The cost focus in construction, so there are reductions that get implied for materials and processes, and compressed timeframes. These days, a project is completed in a much, much shorter time frame than what it used to 20 years ago. And there has to be things along that chain that will be sacrificed that allow the project to be finished quicker. And that often is things like overheads and supervision are less because the project's going for less duration. There's less time in each phase as the project progresses. So there's more chance of defects. Building materials, just really quickly on this one, often lighter, reduced quality. So we do have cheaper materials on the market. We have a problem with untested materials in Australia. So there's various things that come in that are not properly tested to the Australian standards. Cladding was probably one that's old news now, but that one was certainly one that caused a lot of problems and still does. Trades, unfamiliar and untrained. So there are a lot of trades in the industry at the moment that are not trained properly on the new products that are getting developed and implemented. So they're not really understanding how these things go together, or they may not use the whole system requirements. And there's certainly products out there, I'll use cladding as an example, where if the manufacturers offer a warranty on that cladding product, they need you to use the proper system, the battens, the sealants, the sarking, the whole lot needs to go together properly to get that warranty that you're supposed to get on that material. And that's a big shortfall in the industry as well. Often we find one proper component's being used, but the rest haven't been used, so therefore the system doesn't comply. The traditional approach, unfortunately, this is the approach that we see the most in the industry, which is just purely and simply reactive, or whack-a-mole, I guess you could say. And that is finding those defects on projects. The biggest thing we find with strata when defects occur is everything is time sensitive. It's normally got to be fixed quickly because it's leaking or it's creating further loss or damage. So it's got to be done quickly. A contractor comes in, the time that they have to investigate and really unpack the issue and understand what it is often limited, and then it may not occur. It's fixed, and then it goes around in the cycle where it'll reoccur again. So that's probably more of the traditional approach we see at the moment, which does lead to problems. So some of those problems, lack of detailed or independent inspection. So often it is the best practice is to get someone independent or an expert in that field to look at it rather than just get a trade in to fix it. So that would allow proper investigation, independent scope of work, so a scope can be written to suit that item. And then often even a principal contractor to take accountability for the whole works if there are a few elements to that. If it's roofing and there's some damage to paint and a bit of electrical to do, rather than appointing a principal contractor, we often see the individual trades appointed, and the problem that happens there is split warranties and split accountability amongst those individuals rather than the owners benefiting from going directly to one principal contractor. So I'll just cover off on some elements, and in the collection of information over the years, we normally segregate it into these 5 building elements. These elements are more specific to New South Wales legislation at the moment, but they do apply anywhere in Australia, to where most defects will fall into one of these elements, being fire safety, waterproofing, which is obvious, service covers all your services, mechanical, plumbing, electrical, etc., a structural problem, or enclosure, which pretty much is everything else. So that's all of your walls and externals and even internals will put in that enclosure bucket. So to give you an idea, over probably the last 4 years, 4 or 5 years, we've been collecting this information, particularly on the government projects we've been working on in the different states, and trying to get an understanding of where the focus areas are on the building elements, and what's being the most defects in those areas. And I think most people looking at that diagram would point straight to waterproofing and say that would easily be the highest, because I know for most strata managers and owners, they would suggest that that's the area they've had the most problems. Well, what's surprising, and I'll give you the data on the right-hand side there, is by far the biggest problem we found were fire safety systems. So that's fire defects in buildings. That's to do with passive and active fire, which I'll cover off on just in a little while in the presentation, but that's the greater concern for the majority of buildings we went to. And I think part of the reason why us as a business, Sedgwick, can present this to you and say we found fire safety systems the worst is because we're qualified to look at all different things. And I think owners ordinarily would report on what is visibly obvious to them, which in most instances is waterproofing, or a crack, or a structural problem, or even a service problem, but not necessarily fire, because there's a lot to do with fire that untrained people would not notice is wrong. So that's probably why that number looks high. And like I said, I'll go into that shortly, just in terms of some of the things we discovered and some things that owners, excuse me, could look out for. So the other thing I'll point out as well, in all the data that we collected over this period of time, we categorised every defect that we collected into one of 2 categories, which is isolated versus a systemic defect. Now, I refer to an isolated defect as let's say a tradie having a bad day. They've just done a bad job on something. If you have a look at the image on the left-hand side there and the exit sign closely, some of you may have been looking at that thinking, what's wrong with that? Well, you can clearly see it's pointing the wrong way across the balcony. That is someone having a bad day. They've just done it wrong. Good example of an isolated defect. On the right-hand side, we've got repeated error in design or installation. So it might be something systemic. It could be overflows to balconies or cracks on every single level because they duplicated the design. So, and that's important too, because of all the defects we captured over that period of time we worked, we found nearly 50% of the defects we found were actually systemic defects. So the number that we counted over all the projects we did was not actually accurate in terms of the full extent of what it was, because we didn't go through each building and count every duplicated instance of where it happened more than once. We only flagged it once that it was a systemic problem. Getting into what I'll categorise here as visible and obvious defects, and this is for owners. Most owners would notice these sorts of things, would certainly encourage owners to flag them, but water penetration is a big one. And we do see a lot of owners who have parked in car parks for years, seen the leaks, never reported it, assumed it was just something normal that would happen in a basement, and nothing was ever done about it. So certainly, yeah, water penetration in basements is a big one. I'm sure a lot of people on the call today would have seen that sort of problem. Other visible, just general water penetration, that's an eave soffit that's had water come through a fire stairwell as well. I'll point out as well, these are all examples of projects we've worked on over the years. So these are real things that are happening in buildings all around Australia at the moment. So the one on the right, as I pointed out, that's water coming into a stairwell. It was never investigated, and the report we got from the owners or the building manager on that one was, it's always been that way. And that was 6 or 7 years, I think. No one had ever investigated or looked into why it was like that. Water ponding and stains, that's a fairly obvious one. Here's some pictures of rooftops, but certainly when you get marks on a roof, you don't actually have to see water ponding to know that there's a problem on a roof with water ponding. The telltale signs are normally the stains, and in this instance, you'll see dirt's accumulated because water has been sitting there and dust and dirt has built up, and it really shows well how the falls to that roof are not adequate. They're not directed towards the overflows or the drainage points, and that does pond in weather, so which will eventually cause problems because a lot of membranes, although they're designed to stand up to the UV and they're there to withstand water, they're not there as a bathtub, which is what I'll call it. They're not designed to hold water for prolonged periods like that, so eventually they'll fail. Cracks and deformities are, again, fairly obvious. There's a few examples on projects that we've done, but I think most owners, I've still got this in what I refer to as the visible or the obvious defects, but you've got some examples there. Moving on, corrosion as well. We seem to be finding more and more of this lately. The image on the left there is a really poor example of concrete cover that hasn't been poured properly and the reinforcement's exposed and it's corroding and rusting. On the right-hand side there, that's just a simple steel member within a basement car park that is failing because it obviously hasn't had a galvanized coating or something on it to protect it from the kinds of elements it was going to be exposed to. A few other obvious ones, leaching. I'm sure a lot of people have seen that out of balconies. This is the salt coming out and normally associated with water penetration or water issues in a building. The image on the right-hand side, again, also is crack and water penetration through concrete. So you've got that salt leaching through, and you can see a good example there of the salt dripping down. And again, we do often speak to owners who say, I've seen it, but I've never mentioned it or done anything about it. So again, these are good telltale signs to flag if you do see. Another example here is water ponding or stains. So what we've got here is just some open podium level areas. And again, you can see some salt buildup, and it's clear telltale signs that that pavement is not draining properly. Something's going wrong. It could be a block drain, it could be overflows, it could be something wrong. But again, a really easy telltale sign that anybody could look at. And a couple of others here, tiles lifting. This problem was to do with the expansion joints and the expansion joint not being wide enough and not allowing the tiles to move like they should. And we eventually get cracking and or delamination in this instance. So now we get into some less, what I call visible, but less obvious things. The image on the left-hand side there, you probably can't notice much wrong with that at all. The problem with that particular image, and it was a problem in the entire building, is the balcony had no overflows. And balconies do need overflows, so when they do flood, that water has an opportunity to discharge out off the edge of the building rather than come back inside through your sliding door or your door unit. And many buildings we've inspected have had this problem, or they've had the problem where the floor drainage is either the falls are not correct or the drain's non-existent and they don't have overflows. So in those instances, the balcony really has no hope of handling a decent weather event. It's going to eventually flood, and that's going to come inside. On the right-hand side there, I'll call that a less obvious defect. If you look at that, you may not notice too much wrong with it, but if you look at the exit sign, there's obviously no signage within the exit sign. Again, a problem we see in a lot of buildings. Some of the newer type exit signs have like a cardboard insert that provides the direction, whether that be straight ahead, left or right. And we find some of those, particularly the cheaper ones, are deteriorating quickly, dropping out, and you're left with a sign that really is useless. That's not going to guide anyone anywhere in the event of an emergency. Again, less obvious here. Well, the one on the right I wouldn't call less obvious, so I think most people can notice that. But before it lifts off the building, it might just be some mild cracks, which most people probably wouldn't pay too much attention to. The one on the left, that column's only less than 12 months old, and you can see some cracks forming and delamination there. So again, these are some early telltale signs of knowing something's not right there. And the instance of the one on the left, you've only got to walk up and just tap the column, and you can actually hear the surface coating starting to come away, rather than that solid sound that you would normally hear hitting concrete. It's starting to sound a bit loose and drummy. Again, real easy things. If you're in your building and walking past and you notice something, you could easily just tap it with your hand and understand that could be a problem. Maybe I should report that. Couple of other less obvious ones in terms of, I guess, owners not understanding there could be something much bigger going on behind the scenes. But if you look at the planter on the left, there's problems behind there with the membrane it should have, but the membrane's not sitting there. It's not doing its job. The water's starting to come through the wall, and that's only going to exacerbate over time. The image on the right, that's mold, and that's problems with waterproofing up above. So whilst the mold's a problem, it's actually not the root cause of the problem. So that certainly needs further investigation. Some other less obvious things to look at too, things like slow drainage, condensation, window and door operation. So if you do notice your sliding doors or things are starting to jam and not operate the way they used to, again, they're telltale signs. They're less obvious, but they're telltale signs something's not right and something's going on in the building that might need a bit of investigation. Okay, so I'll cover now on just passive and active fire issues, and this is really important, something I'd encourage all owners to take notice of in your buildings, because it is something that most people overlook, yet it's one of the biggest problems in the industry at the moment. So the difference between active and passive fire, just to explain, passive fire protection is anything that's a barrier or a shield or anything to stop the spread of fire, so something that's fixed and non-active. So rather than things like sprinklers and extinguishers that are more active, passive is your doors, your walls, penetrations, lights and signage to guide you. It's things like that, things that make a compartment, a fire compartment in a building. And a compartment could be your unit, it could be an electrical cupboard, it could be the plant room, it could be any of those things. They're all separate compartments in a building, and it's important they all stay as a compartment. So if there's a fire within there, it doesn't escape into other compartments that may affect other areas. So in terms of passive fire, you can see the image here, that's just of a stairwell. The image on the right-hand side, again, that's a fire door, that's a fire exit door, and you can see what's been installed over the top of that door, which doesn't even open properly. Again, a real example of a job that we worked on, which we were astonished to find that as a defect on a building. But it's really important with your passive fire protection and your fire doors and things like that, that they're clear, they operate correctly, and they're not compromised in any way, so that they can perform as they're designed. Other examples, I've got corridors there, and again, the exit light missing. The corridor on the bottom, the proper, that's an example of a project I was on only a few weeks ago, but there's corridors within the building, they're fire escapes, it's missing exit lights. So if you're walking through that corridor, you've got no clue which way to go to escape from the building, and they're obvious things that are missing in terms of the passive fire protection. Covering off here, this is an example. You can see the bottom left image is an electrical cupboard just in a car park area. And the intent of every electrical cupboard, they are, again, are a compartment. So if the switchboard or something goes wrong and catches fire, that fire is contained within that compartment. It doesn't spread anywhere else. And it's got the best chance of holding for a period of time, A, to allow occupants to escape, and B, allow time for fireys to respond to the scene and deal with that fire. What's happened here, I'm sure a lot of people are getting EV or electric vehicle charging stations and cables and cable trays installed in buildings, which is great, and I know that's happening on a regular basis. But this is an example, if you look at the image on the top right, where holes have been drilled through that compartment to get the cabling in, but they've not been sealed back up again. So that's no longer a compartment. Smoke and fire can come back out of that penetration. It hasn't been done properly, and this is a real common problem on a lot of buildings. where there's penetrations to compartments that have not been sealed properly and they've just been left, and it compromises the entire compartment. It will not perform as it was designed, and it's going to provide risk to occupants of the building. So I'll get into active fire protection now. As I mentioned, this is things like sprinklers, hydrants, smoke detection, hose reels, all of those sort of different components. Some of the common problems we find with sprinklers in particular is the sprinkler heads being obstructed by services or equipment on site. The image in the bottom left there is a classic example where the sprinkler fitter most likely came into the building, fitted up all the sprinklers on the project, and then obviously the plumbers come through later and run through the fire services and other gas services or whatever else is in the building, and not considered the spray of the sprinklers and the design of the sprinkler. And that sprinkler effectively is useless. That's not going to perform as it was designed. So that's a common problem. And again, it's something any occupant of any building can notice, that if you're walking around and you look up and you see a sprinkler that's not sitting there where it can disperse properly, and it might be semi-covered by something, it's certainly something you can raise as a problem, and I would encourage you to do so, because your building is not going to perform as it should in the event of a fire, where it's going to spread water properly and extinguish things. The image on the right, that's common as well. We do see these storage boxes put in a lot of car parks in buildings. There's nothing wrong with that. That can be done, but certainly fire sprinkler systems need modification if that happens, just so that the spray can be adjusted so that it still performs properly. So I'm not suggesting you're not allowed to put those in, but it just needs consideration. So as an owners corporation, if you all vote and decide to put those into a car park, I would strongly encourage you to also consider the cost and the requirement to get an expert in to have a look at your sprinkler systems and make sure nothing's impeded. Some other examples here of of active fire protection, things like hose reels and also hydrants. Most people would have seen hydrants around projects, around buildings. There's certain requirements with hydrants for clearances, and it's fairly obvious why that is. It's so when the fireys do turn up, they can connect their hoses freely and get cracking quickly on what they need to do in your building to extinguish that fire. There's two examples there of a breach of the circulation space that's supposed to be in front of a hydrant, so that those things can happen. So again, some really concerning typical defects we find in a lot of projects where it should never have got past the sign-off stage, where a hydrant is impeded and it can't be used properly. So let's get on to what can owners do to, I guess, help flag some of these issues or even notice some of these issues. One of the things I always do as an inspector when I do go to a project is I simulate an evacuation myself if I'm walking out. So if I do walk into a fire stairwell, I say, okay, I'm about to escape, I need to get out. How does this feel to me? I walk down levels. If lights are out, things like lights not functioning properly, if the exit signs are not there guiding you towards the exit, door locks need to operate properly. Very often doors are jammed, the locks are not working properly, there's stuff stacked in front or behind the door, there's signage missing, that sort of thing. They're easy things that anybody can pick up on. If you do notice things like that, I would certainly again encourage you to flag that as a problem. Again, some examples there: an exit light's not working properly, the lock's jammed open. These are things, they need to function properly. A door needs to be self-closing behind you when you go through it, and that's for any sole occupancy unit or any other fire stairwell. The intent of that is it seals that compartment back off again, so that fire can't pass between those two areas and you're not exacerbating the problem of having the fire. So it's essentially that those things operate at all times and not wedged open, or in that case, we've got a broken lock that's just been left that way. The building manager told me it's always been that way, and they've never bothered to do anything about it. So certainly things can be raised as an owner if you walk past it or you go through that door. I would encourage you to notify somebody about it. Another example on the top left there of penetrations, again, in this instance, I think it was a commercial shop fitted in where they'd run beverage lines in, they'd just drilled through a firewall, not resealed it up. Again, we've breached a fire compartment and we've got a problem again. The image on the right, I'm sure a lot of people would have seen this, storage cages, residential storage cages in strata buildings. Those storage cages ordinarily need to have a 500 millimetre clearance or a half-metre clearance from the sprinkler head to anything that's stacked in a storage cage. And the proper way to do that is most storage cages have a ceiling, like a mesh ceiling, so that occupants can't stack anything higher than that distance. In this instance, that ceiling of that storage cage is missing. So of course, occupants will use every bit of space because they need it. And in this instance, that sprinkler won't function at all as it was intended. So again, something that owners can certainly flag if they notice anything like that. I would encourage to flag it with your manager, your strata manager, or even building manager, so it can just be investigated a little bit further. So when should I raise an issue? Look, I think in simple terms, notify immediately. There's really no downside to notifying and compiling a list, whoever that person is who compiles that list. I think it's important that that is reported straight away. The point I've made there, it could be a collective issue others are experiencing. So whilst you might notice something and think it's minor, if you times that by 40, because everyone's having that same problem, it then develops into a much more significant issue. And you're not going to know that unless you report it and that list gets generated and somebody can look at that. So I'd certainly encourage everyone, even if it's minor, get it down on that list so that you can see trends and problems, or it could be isolated and perhaps it is. Like I said before, an example of someone just had a tradie having a bad day where it might just need an isolated fix and that's it. The advantage of early notification. So mitigating further damage is the main one. And certainly with insurance, when they start to look at claims and things down the track, if there has been an incident or, it's something that goes dramatically wrong with a building that causes a claim, they will always look at whether mitigation to further damage has been implemented. And so it is really important to act quickly on that. It also gives the ability, early notification gives the ability to explore causes prior to escalation. So again, most things are time sensitive when they really turn bad. So that early notification might give a cushion of a month or two to get the proper people in to look at it, explore it properly and get to the root cause of what the problem is, rather than just reacting and putting a band-aid on it when it blows up or whatever happens, whatever the problem is we're talking about. It also allows proper planning and forecasting. So if it is a cost forecasting thing where we can look at it and say, okay, it looks like 10 of these components are going to fail over the next 5 years, we can start to plan around that, set a budget for that, and talk about it a bit more rather than wait for it to fail and then the strata be in a position where they've got to get a loan or it's much more difficult to deal with. And I always make this comment, consider common areas, not just lot property. So it is really important for all owners and occupants to try and look around at all of the common areas and everything, not just what's going on in your own lot. A common phrase, and I have heard this quite a few times, I don't want to investigate it as it will cost money and it's likely to result in issues that will also cost to rectify. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that, and I do sympathise with that. But the facts are, and we've been involved in many, many cases, and we've seen this firsthand, those rectification costs can quadruple or even go more than that when they're left unattended. So things like further damage and deterioration, it starts impacting other elements. So it might start to impact other building fabric or whatever it is if it's not dealt with. Just simply rising industry costs. The longer you leave it, the industry and the trades and the way things are going, it's not getting any cheaper to fix things. So you really are, I would encourage people to at least start looking at things and even staging them early rather than leaving them, because it's only going to exacerbate that problem. And as I mentioned before, insurance coverage, that can be impacted as well. And certainly if you do have problems on a building and it's pre-existing maintenance or defects, that may become an exclusion in your insurance policy, or it could increase your premium, or it could have other implications. So certainly just dealing with things quickly, it has far greater advantages than leaving them. So my final statement there, early detection can allow preventative measures and proper planning to control and lower costs. So again, time sensitive, if you can get away from that time sensitive problem where you have to react super fast and get a trade in quickly by the weekend to get it fixed, you're in a much better position because you've got time to make proper decisions. You can get proper experts in, you can consider it, you can get additional quotes. There's so many advantages to that. So just to wrap up now, the final slide, what can owners do to be proactive? So the first thing, ensuring a maintenance plan is in place and is being actioned. Now, I know in the different states around Australia, there's legislation even that sort of demands this in certain places, or at least the initial maintenance schedules. But the maintenance plan overarches that, and it's a proper plan that most buildings should have, or all buildings should have, planning out what I call short, medium and long term things that need addressing on your building. And I can't stress enough, it is so important to have that in place, because particularly with some of the longer term things that you should consider, and the obvious ones, things like repainting or resurfacing and that sort of thing, they need to be considered and put in as part of a budget so that you don't get caught out later on. The second point I'll raise is know your building. And I think getting people to just be alert and invested in your building. You walk in and out every single day, you walk past things every single day. Just be alert and be invested in that. Report anything that changes. If you notice the yard out the front you walk past is all of a sudden damp constantly, there's going to be something wrong there. So just keeping that broad eye, I guess, on all the different building elements. Everyone can do that to just help support any change that might occur. Report things that impact the community and not just yourself. I touched on that before, but it is important that you do consider the whole building and the community rather than just what's going on within your sole occupancy unit. Try and consider everything, because those things eventually are going to impact you anyway if they become a common property issue that then requires a broader rectification. And as I mentioned before, simulate situations in the event of emergency. Would I be safe? Does this seem right? My one is just walking through out exits and looking around, thinking, okay, if I was walking out here, would I be impeded? Does this actually seem right? Most people would know when you walk through certain areas whether something just doesn't feel right in terms of the way it's put together. So I'd certainly consider that if in your apartment or wherever you are, if something happened, where would you go to get out of the building? What would you leverage, whether it be a hose reel or extinguisher, or but consider that, and that might then lead you towards problems in your building that you might be able to report. Understand your building. I would really encourage people to plan and forecast routine inspections by experts, building experts, to look at defects, because there's a lot of occasions where we've come in and been asked to do a defect report on a building. We might be 1 or 2 years too late on the basis the time bars have kicked in on the statutory warranty periods in the particular state. That's always really disappointing if that occurs, because there's very little we can do to help them in terms of pursuing something against a builder. But even after that, having routine inspections to help flag really early problems can be really beneficial to owners, because that information can be used to help plan ahead if there's something that is suspected is going to go wrong into the future. And you've got to treat those expert costs as an investment, not as an expense, because it is imperative to get that look at your building. At least I would recommend once every 5 years, but certainly if you've got a newer building, I would recommend it earlier, on the basis of at least 12 months before the expiry of any statutory warranty periods. You have to give enough time to get the builder mobilised, to give them the opportunity to have a look at what's wrong and come in and fix it. And if they choose not to, you've still got a buffer zone before the expiry of that defect period to take some action if you do need to do that. And the last one, which I've covered already, avoid quick fixes. So really try hard not to just whack band-aids on everything when it happens. Even if we're talking about those isolated defects that I mentioned before, it needs to be considered, should we investigate other areas properly prior to fixing it. And I think things like even sills on windows with leaks where they go wrong and you might need an isolated fix there. Is it possible that all the windows are like this? And it might be worth just having a bit of investigation to that, because if nothing else, it might then allow some planning rather than just fixing one thing in isolation and not having a broader look. So was it systemic and could it return in other areas? That's probably one consideration I have when I look at it, look at any defect to try and make sure that we're not overpassing an issue that'll come back and get us later on. Okay, so thanks, Nikki. That's probably the end of what I wanted to cover off on today. And I've just got there's a QR code on the screen there which leads to the Sedgwick strata page. And one of the things we do have on our strata page, dedicated page is a bunch of resource documents. So there's bits and pieces on all sorts of things on there that if people are interested, they can certainly navigate across to that and have a look.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bruce. You mentioned quite a bit around the fire safety risks, and we were just asked in chat, wouldn't this be picked up in a fire inspection, and are OCs not having fire safety inspections regularly?
I would encourage any other additional expert to come in and look, because I think that is important. There's several experts looking at it. Your routine fire inspections generally won't cover off on some of the things I covered, such as the hydrant clearances and some of those other things. I think they're the areas that potentially they won't delve into. So it certainly would be beneficial to get additional inspections if you suspect on your property that there are problems in those areas. And again, as I pointed out, it doesn't take a lot to have a look at certain things and know that looks like it's obstructed, or that doesn't look like it would be easy to get to, or just simple things like that. They're worth raising so that you could, take it further.
Okay, thank you. And then we were asked, in terms of bubbling plaster, is there an issue if it's dried up? Also, how do you tell if cracks are an issue or just natural?
Normally it's the drumminess. So as I mentioned before, in going past anything that's cracked, I would normally just knock it, or in some instances you can get an implement hammer or something and just give it a light tap to see how drummy that is. So the drummier it is, the more it's become detached and the more the failure is. Hairline cracks are quite different. And if you do see just a hairline crack in something, I think most people would understand they're very, very common in Australia. You're going to see them in just about every building, and there is a tolerance on that. So not all hairline cracks are necessarily a defect. It's only when they reach a point that they start to separate over millimetres that it becomes a problem.
Okay, and also national question, is the protection provided by the defects period the same for all works, and what is the legal or contractual basis for the defect period protection?
It does vary a little bit state to state, and I think what we're referring to there is the statutory period on builders and licensing in the different areas. So that does vary a little bit state to state, and you would have to look at your state in terms of what it is. There are some more standard 6 or 6.5 year periods in the eastern states that are fairly typical, but they're split into two areas, which is basically structural and non-structural, or in another term, serious or not so serious. What's really important is the more cosmetic things, or the non-structural items. They are the defects that tend to expire the quickest in terms of the statutory warranty periods. So they're the ones you need to get addressed as quickly as possible, sometimes as short as 12 months that can expire after the handover of a building. So I'd certainly encourage everybody to get on the front foot with that. If you have those, what you consider more non-structural defects, and that's all your cosmetic things, your cracking, your tile issues, your paint, all of that stuff, I think it's important to get that sorted very quickly early so that you can get the accountability from the builder early. Your bigger problems, like your large structural problems, and that they tend to be something that will push out for the duration of the longer period, but it does thin out in terms of the types of things that are covered for that full duration.
And again, in in Queensland, when it comes to ageing properties with concrete cancer, if the cost to repair is equal to or more than the sinking fund, what options do owners have? Are we best to consider terminating the scheme and selling to a developer?
Look, that's hard to answer in terms of not knowing what the sinking fund value is, but certainly there are a lot of innovative solutions to concrete cancer now. That's an area that's changed a lot in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. There's different solutions there. I'd certainly encourage anybody to explore experts in that area on concrete cancer and get some really good sound advice on that. Then beyond that, I would certainly recommend getting cost analysis done on that, whether it be a quantity surveyor or an expert in the industry to provide costs in real terms of what it would obviously cost the owners to remediate the building if they were to use some of these newer methods, and then explore it from there. And I think, you know, the option of selling the building and terminating the scheme, in my view, would be last resort and extreme, but not saying that wouldn't be the final conclusion, but certainly I'd encourage people to explore some of the good options out there, because it could be something that might actually assist.
From Queensland, we're in a large beachfront tower. Every lot has a large balcony. What proactive maintenance measures can be taken to prolong the life of our building and reduce maintenance costs over the long term? How do we budget for future repairs and maintenance costs associated with building defects?
A maintenance plan is critical to the building. If there's not one already, there should be one, particularly, especially on coastal properties that are exposed to that extreme marine environment. If it's beachfront, it's in the highest category of exposure. So there's certainly a lot of considerations on elements on that building that need to be considered. So I would recommend, first and foremost, getting a maintenance plan and getting someone to draw that maintenance plan for you up. There are experts who will come in and do that. But during that process, what they will do is they will discover on your building what are the elements that need the most attention. I'm not sure what the building looks like. It could have timber slats, it could have aluminium steel components that need maintenance over a period of time, wash down. The timber work might need recoating every 5 years. I'm not sure. So that would be the first part. I would certainly encourage people to have a maintenance plan. And then the second part of that question, in terms of cost, there are cost experts out there who can extrapolate maintenance costs over short, medium, and long term. So again, once your maintenance plan's in place, you could get a cost expert like a quantity surveyor to have a look at that and put in a bit of a capital works plan for you where you can extrapolate the costs over that period and help to plan for that. Again, it's something we see it occasionally, but not often, and I'd like to see it more where owners do plan for that better, so there's no surprises on them, and they've got a very clear vision of where they're heading over the next 10 years and what the building's going to need. But certainly, as I pointed out, a coastal or a beachfront property would be in the extreme end of needing a very, very polished maintenance plan so that you're confident in how you go forward with your building.
Okay. And then a New South Wales question. There are early signs of defects in our 8-year-old building. The builder is insolvent. What are the different dispute resolution options available in case of disputes over building defects, such as mediation, arbitration, or litigation?
Okay, so the first thing, if the builder's insolvent, unfortunately, there's not a lot of action you can take against the builder. And so mechanisms like arbitration or mediation are pretty much dissolved on the basis that the builder's dissolved. It's not to say, but that legal action might not still be possible against the entity or the individual. I would certainly be looking for legal advice on that one. I couldn't advise on the best way forward to pursue something on that. But yeah, it's an extremely unfortunate part about the industry when that occurs. It leaves owners in a very difficult position. And that one, yeah, I would certainly recommend getting some legal advice just to unpack if there's any avenue in terms of pursuing the entity or the person, if that's available still.
And Bruce, is that state specific? Because we had a very similar question come in from Victoria, which was almost identical. Would it be the same in the state of Victoria?
It would be the regulators in those instances. There's little they can do because the builder won't be trading if they're insolvent or shouldn't be trading. If they are still trading, then certainly that's something the regulator could step in on. But if they're not trading and they're insolvent, it becomes outside of that, and it's something you would need to get legal advice on, depending on where you are, which state.
Okay, thank you. From WA, at what stage does external brickwork fretting require attention? Is tuck pointing preferred to repointing, and how often should pointing take place?
Okay, so tuck pointing is more of a cosmetic fix normally used on heritage buildings. It's a combination of colours of mortar to I guess you could use the term beautify the way that the brickwork looks after fretting. Generally speaking, with masonry, you would not normally need to repoint. I would recommend repointing firstly, but secondly, you wouldn't need to repoint unless there's obvious signs of fretting or deterioration of the mortar or a depth that's different or uncommon to the rest of the mortar. So if you can clearly see that it's a deeper mortar joint and it's fretting, then it will need some attention. So that's the point in time where you would need to get someone in to look at repointing that area. But certainly there's buildings, I think I'm not sure in Australia, but we've seen them in Europe and other places that will go for hundreds, if not thousands of years and never need repointing. A lot of the pointing in the mortar in masonry depends on the environmental conditions and the exposure of the building. It can depend on the mortar itself when it was made up and laid and fitted. So there's a few influencing factors there, but certainly there's no requirement to repoint every 2 years, 5 years, or anything like that. It is purely on visual, whether you can see it's deteriorating, then certainly you'd need to pay it some attention.
Or is there anything you'd like to leave us with? Any final thoughts on the subject?
No, look, I think there's some positive things happening in the industry at the moment on change, and I always like to end on that note. I hate talking about negative things all the time in the industry, and yes, defects are a big problem, but there's some really encouraging industry change going on, and it is happening, starting to cascade through from different states. For the newer buildings, it may not help existing owners of buildings, but it's certainly setting the scene for the future in terms of more accountability, more scrutinisation on the design to prevent these defects from happening in the future. So watch this space on that one. The tides are changing. It's getting tougher on builders to walk away. So yeah, we're heading in the right direction, but it's a slow grind. And I would just encourage owners to certainly be as aware as you possibly can of your building. It is your building, it's your asset. Take a little bit more ownership and notice of things that are going on, report them, and I think you've got a better chance of getting on top of them.
I think that's great. That sounds really positive. Bruce, thank you so much. If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.